anyone has any issues in terms of appearing on camera and that kind of thing, then we will, of course, try to edit that out, or if you can maybe turn your camera off, that is also an option. But thank you again, once again, for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Portia and Erlinda.
Thanks, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Portia Allen Kyle. I'm here representing Count Us In, along with my colleague, Erlinda, who will be translating this for you this evening. Tonight, one moment, let me go ahead and share my screen so you can see what I see. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation here. I'm going to be talking about absentee voting in Indiana. And so, you know, as Tariq mentioned, if there are any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, and there will be, you know, ample time for comments and conversation at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Erlinda briefly, and then jump right in.
Bienvenidos a todos a la presentación. Hoy hablaremos de el voto en ausencia en Indiana. Si tiene cualquier pregunta o comentario, por favor ingresen en el chat y responderemos a sus preguntas al final de la presentación.
Okay. So absentee voting, just want to start just in terms of terminology. When people say absentee voting, or people talk about vote by mail, they are two sides of the same coin. And so we will be talking about absentee voting and using that terminology, since that is the term that Indiana uses. There are 28 states that allow voters to vote absentee without needing a valid excuse. Indiana is not one of them. Indiana is one of the 17 states that require an excuse to vote absentee, and there are currently 5 states that automatically mail ballots to all voters. And so in the midst of the pandemic, you know, it'll be very important to make sure, understanding why people may want to cast absentee ballots, it'll be important to understand the rules and eligibility in order to do so for this November election.
El voto por correo y el voto la votación en ausencia son palabras similares y significan lo mismo. Entonces, hoy día hablaremos del voto, la votación en ausencia, ya que este término es usado por Indiana. Entonces, Indiana es uno de los estados que requieren una excusa para votar en ausencia. Hay otros 28 estados que permiten la votación en ausencia sin necesidad que una excusa sea presentada, y Indiana no es uno de ellos. Hay 5 estados que envían de manera automática las votaciones.
So before we dive into November, I want to talk a little bit about Indiana's primary that just passed in June. You know, when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, originally the primary was scheduled for March 25th. It was decided to be rescheduled for June 2nd. And as a part of making accommodations, you know, for voting during the pandemic, there were a number of different legal orders that were put in place. The first one was, you know, by the Election Commission. It was Order 2020-37. It extended absentee voting with no excuse required. So all voters for the June primary were able to cast absentee ballots without needing, you know, an excuse or to be eligible to fill one, to cast one, because they meet certain qualifications. So that was a new change for the primary. This order also adjusted the application and return deadlines accordingly, and limited in-person voting only to the week before the election. Usually it is 28 days of early voting in person prior to an election. For the primary, it was only 1 week. Governor Holcomb then instituted an executive order to address the kind of crisis in poll workers by saying that poll worker stipends won't count against unemployment benefits. The goal here was to try to incentivize people to become poll workers, you know, understanding that there are a lot of people in economic turmoil who are now qualify for unemployment because of the pandemic, and wanting to recruit as many people as possible to keep open polling places and make voting accessible.
Nos gustaría primero hablar de la elección primaria de Indiana de este año 2020 y los preparativos. Esta elección fue aplazada del 25 de marzo al 12 de junio por caso de la pandemia. Y para hacer algunas acomodaciones, órdenes legales fueron puestas en lugar, como la orden 2020-37 de la Comisión Electoral Indiana. Esta orden extendió la votación en ausencia a todos los votantes sin necesidad que una excusa fuera presentada. También ajustó los plazos para solicitar la votación en ausencia y para completar la votación. Esta orden también limitó el voto en persona una semana antes de la elección. Usualmente la votación en persona tiene lugar 28 días antes de que tiene lugar la elección. Entonces eso cortó el tiempo para votar en persona a una semana. Otra orden que fue puesta en lugar es la orden ejecutiva del gobernador Holcomb. Esta orden dictó que los estipendios de los trabajadores electorales no contarán contra los beneficios de desempleo. Y esta orden fue puesta en lugar para poder reclutar más trabajadores electorales, ya que carecían mucho para esta elección, debido a lo que estaba sucediendo en el mundo con relación a la pandemia.
And so despite all of those changes to adapt the voting system, especially to kind of scale up and anticipate the increase in absentee voting, being that this was the first time that all voters would be eligible to vote without needing an excuse, despite those changes to the rules, there were still issues with the primary in June. The first is that there were a lot of consolidated voting locations, and there was only a week to vote instead of the month, and that resulted in long lines and long wait times. The second is that there were delays in processing ballots, partially because there were so many more absentee ballots that were cast, since so many more people were eligible to use them. The other side of that is there were fewer people to help the processing of ballots on the election side. And so that led to some anticipated delays. The third issue was, and we've heard a lot about some of the concerns with the Postal Service, but because of the influx of absentee ballots, and there were so many people using them who had never done so before, people who were not familiar with the absentee voting process. Many submitted requests that were late, which caused the ballots to be received late often. Some ballots weren't received at all by voters who requested them. And so there were, a number of issues just dealing with the capacity and getting ballots out.
Y a partir de que hubo estas órdenes puestas en lugar para poder acomodar a la situación que estaba sucediendo, hubo algunos problemas. Por ejemplo, algunas de las ubicaciones de votación fueron consolidadas, disculpe, y un periodo de votación anticipada, hubo un periodo de votación anticipada más corto. Esto causó largas filas y largas esperas. Otro problema que sucedió es que hubo tardanzas en procesar las votaciones. También algunas votaciones fueron recibidas muy tarde, incluso otras no fueron recibidas en absoluto. Entonces hubo fallas en la capacidad del Estado para poder acomodar a la situación. Y por resultado hubo estos tres problemas con el proceso de votación.
And so I wanted to give all that context because it's important to understand where we are now going forward to November. So the rules will be different going into the November election, which is why outreach is going to be so important to make sure that people turn out.
Y les quería dar ese contexto para poder explicarles la situación para noviembre, ya que va a ser muy distinta a la situación que sucedió en junio.
So in-person voting will still be available. The early voting period is back to its regular 28 days prior to an election. So it will begin October 6th at noon. It's required, early voting is required to be provided the 2 Saturdays prior to the election. So that is October 24th and October 31st. For counties under 20,000, I'm sorry, this is going to get very technical, Herlinda, but for counties that are under 20,000 people, they're only required to provide 4 hours of voting on the weekend. For larger counties, they're required to provide a full day worth of early voting. And it's important to, recognize this, especially given all of the concerns with the post office, because you can still vote in person early or on election day, even if you request your absentee ballot.
Sí, y aún habrá la votación anticipada. La votación anticipada comenzará el 4 de octubre del año 2020 a mediodía. Y esto debe estar disponible el 24 de octubre del 2020 y el 31 de octubre. Entonces puede votar en persona con anticipación o el día de la elección, aunque hayas solicitado una votación en ausencia. Para agregar a eso, añadir a eso, los condados que tienen menos de 20,000 personas requieren tener 4 horas de votación los fines de semana, y esto es diferente para condados que contienen más de 20,000 personas. Entonces es algo importante para saber en caso de que quieran votar en persona antes de la elección.
So who is eligible to cast an absentee ballot? So I mentioned that Indiana is an excuse required absentee state. So while people can cast absentee ballots or a ballot that will be sent in by mail if they, for example, will be traveling during an election or, have another approved excuse, not everyone will be eligible to cast an absentee ballot simply because of the pandemic this time around. And so there was a lawsuit trying to expand absentee balloting eligibility without needing the excuse, and the court decided not to extend it to the November election. In addition to the court not extending it, the Indiana Election Commission has the power to modify, change, or suspend voting rules and regulations. The commission kind of deadlocked stuck in a partisan deadlock, voted 2-2 not to suspend the excuse requirement. So everyone who wants to cast an absentee ballot will only be able to do so if they meet one of the approved excuse conditions under law. From a deadline perspective, the final day to request an absentee ballot is 12 days prior to an election. So for this election in November, October 22nd is the last day you can request your absentee ballot. And that means that election officials need to have your application for the request in hand on this day.
Entonces, ¿quién es elegible para votar en ausencia? Ah, los requisitos son diferentes para esta elección. No pueden nombrar a COVID-19 como presentar COVID-19 como una excusa para votar en ausencia en esta elección. Entonces, a pesar de que hubo una demanda pidiendo que que no haya necesidad, o sea, requerimientos para votar en esencia, aún lo habrán. La Comisión Electoral de Indiana votó 2-2 a no suspender el requerimiento de una excusa. También desde un punto de vista de plazos, debe solicitar una votación para el 22 de octubre del año 2020 antes de las 11:59 p.m. Entonces, debe solicitarla 12 días antes de la elección en noviembre. Y esto significa que debe estar a mano de la comisión o de los trabajadores electorales. No puede enviarla, por ejemplo, a las 11:59 y ser aceptada. Entonces tiene que ser enviada y recibida por los trabajadores electorales para antes de las 11:59 del día 22 de octubre.
And the last thing on the slide, even though Indiana is a voter ID state, you can request an absentee ballot without needing to, send a copy of your ID. You can just provide the identifying information and receive your ballot.
Y la última cosa para agregar a esta diapositiva es que puede solicitar la votación en ausencia sin tener una identificación. Entonces, para que tomen eso en mente.
So just to recap and drive that home, having COVID, although it can kind of fit under an excuse for sickness, being afraid of contracting COVID, wanting to adhere to social distancing or maintain a quarantine will not be a valid excuse to request and cast an absentee ballot for the November election.
Entonces, nombrar el COVID-19 no es una excusa, o sea, tenerlo o tener miedo de contagiarse del COVID-19 no es una excusa válida que será aceptada para poder votar en ausencia para noviembre.
Okay, so how do you cast an absentee ballot? First, you have to submit the application. When you submit the application, and you can send the application in by mail, or you can return it in person to your local election official's office. When you do that, they will send you a ballot. One thing to note, so Indiana does pay for return postage for absentee ballots. Indiana does not cover postage for the absentee ballot application. And so if you are going to return it by mail, that is up to the voter to cover the postage for that communication. When the ballot is received by the voter, they can complete it, and then they can either return it in person or return it back by mail, regardless of how they decide to regardless of how a voter decides to return it. It has to be received by the elections board on or before election day. And so even if the ballot is postmarked by election day and then comes in the following day or a few days later, that ballot will not be counted. It's late, and that is it.
Entonces, ¿cómo aplicar para una votación en ausencia? Debe completar un formato que debe enviar a la comisión electoral. Este formato lo debe enviar ya sea por correo o llevarlo a la oficina de la comisión electoral en su condado. Entonces, Indiana, y algo útil para saber cuando esté completando el formato es que Indiana cubre el franqueo postal para las votaciones en ausencia. pero no cubrirá el franqueo postal para una vez que complete el formato de votar en ausencia. Entonces, eso lo va a tener que cubrir usted. Las votaciones deben ser recibidas antes del día de la elección o el mismo día de la elección. Si son recibidas después, el voto no será contado.
So what happens if there's an issue with an absentee ballot? And this is where there's a little bit of good news on the horizon. So a little bit of context here, with more people sending absentee ballots, there's been real concerns about ballot rejections in that voters who are younger, voters who are newer and less familiar with absentee voting, tend to be more likely to have their ballots rejected. So this is a year full of lawsuits. Another lawsuit filed recently had a decision that, Indiana previously, if your signature didn't match, if the signature on your ballot didn't match the signature on your voter registration, then they would toss your ballot out and it wouldn't count. So the court said that doing that, tossing ballots just because the signatures don't match isn't constitutional, that they need to let voters know and give them an opportunity to fix the issue with the ballot. And so, I'm sorry, Herlinda, this is going to be a little long. But so how do signature mismatches happen? We all sign things all the time, right? And if you've ever used a digital signature, for example, sometimes it looks really, really different than what your signature looks like on paper. And so if your voter registration signature was captured perhaps digitally, such as like at a DMV or something of the sort, and then you signed your paper absentee ballot, sometimes it can look like the signatures don't match. The other ways that can happen is, people's signatures change over time. So for example, your signature in high school probably looks really different than your signature, even 5 years later in college or, after college versus like as an adult. And so depending on when you registered and how you signed it, your signature probably is just evolved and can look different if you haven't updated your registration. So because of this court decision, the Secretary of State is required to let county officials know that they need to implement a cure process. And all a cure process refers to is telling voters about the mistakes on their ballot and giving them a chance to cure it or make it right. And so they can't just toss your vote without giving you a chance to fix the issue.
Entonces, ¿qué sucede si hay algún problema con la votación en ausencia? Aquí es donde hay un poco de buenas noticias. En veces, por ejemplo, si las firmas, la firma de la votación en ausente no coincide con la firma o su firma en la identificación, puede causar problemas. Entonces, y aquí, la buena noticia viene en que un tribunal federal dictaminó recientemente que la práctica de Indiana de tirar las boletas debido a la falta de coincidencia en estas firmas es inconstitucional. Entonces, el secretario de Estado tiene la obligación de informar a los funcionarios del condado de que deben poner en práctica un proceso de curación. Y este proceso simplemente es que los funcionarios del condado deben darles la oportunidad de corregir o remediar los errores en sus boletines. Esto, la causa o el acto de que las firmas no coinciden puede venir de que su firma ha desenvolvido en los años, ha cambiado, o también puede ser que la firma digital que haya obtenido en su identificación cuando fue al BMV es distinta a la firma que tiene cuando está utilizando un lápiz para firmar, por ejemplo. Entonces, de esto puede resultar a la falta de coincidencia en las firmas, pero la buena noticia es que tienen la oportunidad de remediar o corregir esos errores en sus boletines. Así que los funcionarios electorales ya no pueden descalificar una votación sin dar a los votantes la oportunidad de arreglar el problema.
Okay. So I wanted to give a few places where you can go for more information. The Secretary of State's website, the Indiana Election Commission also, has information for November's absentee voting. If you're curious on how, voting laws in Indiana have changed, the Voting Rights Lab maintains a detailed tracker, not just of legislation that in current law, but also things that are pending as well as litigation. And then vote.org is a website where you can check your registration, you can, pledge to vote, you can, it helps provide the links to, request ballots and things of that nature. I guess the one obvious resource I left off is the Indianapolis Public Library, which is also a great place to get information on this upcoming election. Sorry, Herlinda.
Entonces puede obtener más información acerca de su registro de voto o acerca de las votaciones en ausencia en los siguientes links. Uno de ellos es el link para la Secretaría del Estado de Indiana. El segundo es para la Comisión Electoral Indiana. Y el tercer link es de Voting Rights Lab, donde puede acceder a información acerca de pólizas o de demandas que están en proceso acerca de la votación. También puede encontrar información acerca de su registro de voto en vote.org y también acerca de la votación en ausencia. Entonces pueden utilizar estos siguientes links para obtener más información junto con el link del sitio web de la Biblioteca Pública de Indiana. También ellos contienen información útil acerca del voto.
And I can send this presentation to Tariq if it's helpful to make available. And that is all. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. And thanks so much for the time.
Y eso es todo. Si tienen algunas preguntas, muéstrenlas o escríbanos en el chat. Y gracias por su tiempo.
That is a great question. There's a question in the chat. How long do you have to prove your signature after the election? And the current answer is not sure. Those rules are still being written. And so as they will be written and adapted, the one thing I'll say that is possible is because it is going to be, it seems like it will be up to county election officials to determine what process they're going to go by. It is quite possible that it would be different across the state.
Entonces, una de las preguntas es que cuánto tiempo tienen después de la elección para comprobar su firma, y eso aún no lo sabemos. Hay legislación que está en procedimiento que va a dar más información acerca de eso, y creemos que las reglas serán distintas para cada estado.
Well, thank you again so much, Portia and Erlinda, for sharing all of that information. Is there another question? Looks like there's one more question. From Regina, if returning a ballot instead of mailing, do you have to hand it to an election official?
So the answer is it depends. So where there are, well, and it depends on a couple of things. So some places will have, what they call drop boxes. And so even though, you're kind of returning it in person, you can return it in some places, in some counties, to a drop box of sorts, which is kind of like a USPS post box, except just for ballots, and doesn't require postage or anything like that. If you are returning it to a county election office, they may or may not have a collection box somewhere in the office, but often you will have to, if you return it in person there, hand it to the election officials. And the same on election day, if you go in with your ballot, you drop it off and hand it to a poll worker.
Entonces, una de las preguntas es que si se debe dar la votación en ausencia a un oficial de la comisión electoral, y la respuesta a eso es que depende de dónde vivan. Puede que haya una caja donde pueden depositar a la votación en la votación en ausencia, y para eso no van a necesitar postal o un franqueo postal. Pueden simplemente depositarlo. Si no hay ese tipo de cajas en el condado donde viven, sí van a tener que dárselo a mano a un oficial de la comisión electoral. Entonces va a depender del condado en el que vivan, si deben dárselo a mano o depositarlo en una caja.
And it looks like we have one other question in the chat. What made the courts decide against a no excuse vote by mail for the general election? Just curious about that rationale.
Yeah, the question in the court is different than the question facing, the Indiana Election Commission, for example. So the question facing the commission is, one of a rule change. The question facing the court is, does the petitioning has the petitioning party, met their burden to justify the court interceding and interjecting in that way? And so here, it's just an example of the court finding that plaintiffs had not met their burden for an order of that sort to be made, especially, and when you combine that with the many political factors, when you combine that with some of the other areas where this change could have been made, right? So the Indiana Election Commission could do it. They haven't done it, right? The legislature potentially has a role. The legislature hasn't done it. The governor has a little bit of power here. The governor hasn't done it. And so, even politically, though courts are apolitical, it's, hard to think of, it's hard to justify that, type of ruling, even aside from their meeting their burden, when there are so many other areas and branches of government where, some responsibility for action could lie, and they've all decided not to. The other side of that is, the relentless attacks on, the institution of absentee voting and, the points of fraud and, the USPS, unreliability and a lot of other things that politically have made it unfeasible outside of the courts to make that change. Combined with the fact that some people believe we're just not in a pandemic anymore. And so if you can go and outdoor dine, then you can go vote, right? If you can, go and do a lot of other things, then you can go vote.
I'm trying to summarize that. You're fine, no worries. It's a good information to have. So, una de las preguntas es que determinó la decisión del Tribunal Federal a decidir que debe haber un requerimiento para poder votar, para poder presentar un voto en ausencia. Básicamente, esto fue una decisión también política. Muchos del país están abriendo, de los negocios están abriendo, entonces ellos decidieron que se puede poder votar, ir en persona a votar. Entonces es una decisión política de quién es responsable y también básicamente de que si se puede o no votar en este tiempo cuando todos los negocios están siendo abiertos. Basically, that's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, again, we just want to extend our thanks to Portia and Erlinda for tonight's presentation. Again, we have recorded this session, and we will be reaching out to folks to fill out a liability photo waiver in order to, if your likeness does appear on camera. But the first presentation is now up on our YouTube channel, so feel free to check that out. And this one will be up there as well following tying this all together. So again, thank you to Countess Indy, and all of our presenters. Thank you to Jalen for saying yes and accepting this opportunity to partner. And yes, please be on the lookout for more programs coming up. We are still getting things in the works for our upcoming Tuesdays. So just be on the lookout for that. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.